This episode of the Design Your Dream Home podcast is brought to you by CRAN. CRAN is the Custom Residential Architects Network, and by Porcelanosa. Porcelanosa is a luxury lifestyle brand that brings modern European design into your home. You are listening to the Design Your Dream Home podcast with Doug and Steve. Doug and Steve are architects, and they're here to help you design your dream home. So today we're talking with Christopher Rose of Christopher Rose Architects in Johns Island, South Carolina. I met Chris at our CRAN event, that's the Custom Residential Architects Network, in Charleston in 2014. We actually got to visit some of his work out on Kiowa Island, which was a real treat. So if you've never been to that island, you should make a point of getting out there. It's just off the coast of Charleston. It's really beautiful and some stunning architecture out there. I'd actually hoped to work with Chris on a project on that island a few years ago. I contacted him and I was all ready to get going, and it fell through, unfortunately, so we didn't get to work with one another, but maybe someday. So let me tell you a little bit about Chris. He went to Clemson, where he got his BA and master's degree. He is both a licensed architect and an interior designer. He has over 20 years of experience doing high-end residential work, hospitality, commercial, and institutional design work. He's received many local, regional, and national design awards. He sat on the Kiowa Island Resort Architectural Review Board from 1993 to 2001. He's also worked on the planning of several new communities and recreational facilities. In 1991, the AIA presented its highest recognition to Chris, the National Honor Award for the Charleston Cottages, prototypes for housing for the homeless. And he was or is the youngest recipient of that award ever. So Chris, welcome. It's great to have you. Thanks for agreeing to come on the show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about, I guess we could start with, why did you become an architect? I always love to hear about that. And then tell us a little bit about your career and how things have taken off down there on Johns Island, just south of Charleston.
Well, it's one of those, I was one of the unusual kids kind of growing up, knowing, always loved to draw and paint, but I looked at my work and I just didn't think I drew well enough to make my livelihood as a commercial artist. And so I'm trying to think of something that could work. Actually, I had a great grandfather who was an architect. Of course, I never knew him, but I just knew that from relatives and family history.
Yeah.
But anyway, one of my brothers was studying building science, and he said, "What about architecture?" But my other, I'm the youngest of four, so they were all trying to talk me into go. I would make these little balsa wood models, and they're like, "Oh, why don't you become a dentist? You like work with little things, and you're good in science." I'm like, no. So anyway, I thought about architecture. I'm like, this is cool. I get to draw and design and. Anyway, so that's really why I hopped in, and between my freshman year and my sophomore year was the first time I literally had darkened an architect's office, and I'm like, well, I hope to goodness I enjoy it, because here I am, I'm committed to go to have this in college, and anyway, I loved it and have been there ever since. So.
Now, you said before we got started here, you said you do a lot of hand drawing. Is that correct? You still do that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've with our interns, I keep talking about how technology, because I started practice when we actually used to draw, ink on Mylar and
Right.
all hand drafting, and then slowly as we transition, all the backups that we use for technology. And we were one of the early, people that started using technology. But we found that I primarily done all the things that you talked about, but primarily in the last 24 years, have pretty much been doing custom residential. And we found that in that market, it's totally counterintuitive. If you show them a hardline drawing, they figure they can't or it kind of shuts them down, and they don't feel that they can change it. So the hand drawing showing kind of as you know, there was some programs way back, Squiggle and a couple other programs that took computer drawings and kind of made them messy to look
Yes.
like. And actually, I gave a lecture years ago at Washington University, and a guy, he had a big thing. He would loosen the pins on a pin bar plotter to make it look like hand drawn. So, but anyway, it's kind of interesting. We just want that initial conceptual drawing to kind of, engage the client, and having that hard line, it just doesn't. And it allows them to get, because I always tell people I went through 6 years of design school and can, take criticism. So it's your home. We don't want to shove a white box down your throat if it's not what you want, that sort of thing, because you're going to have to, live in this home. So that's always been, kind of the way. And it was just, how we work. And it, again, allows you to, the interesting thing with the computer, when you do the iterations, you can do overlays quickly and that sort of thing. And but the conceptual, it's always worked better for me to do the hand drawing. So
Interesting.
At what point, Chris, do you transition then to the computer for more production-oriented drawings?
pretty much right after that. I mean,
Okay.
we hop right in, because it's just, as I tell people, this is, usually depending on the size of the home, it's a fairly small scale. It's like at a 16th or 8th, and just kind of get some feedback from everyone. And then once we've got their feedback, then we start hardlining. So.
And so the process then for, let's say, concept or schematic design is you do some hand drawings, maybe a little bit of coloring, try to give the drawing some life, but also leave it open-ended enough that a client can feel like they can interact with you and go back and forth. So that's kind of the process for you?
Exactly.
Got
And
it.
of course, we still do it once we've got the, hardline drawings. But it's interesting. I know it's counter intuitive for most people, but we've just found that clients kind of close down if there's a hard line, real slick presentation. And so it's pretty interesting in that regard. So.
What about
Like-
physical models? Do you make physical models?
We do occasionally, but now we're, actually my office, we have a ton of physical models, but we're more going to, we just did one. We're doing this large home up, probably about 80 miles from here, and the middle part of the state, which has some nice topography. I'm in Charleston, so we're nice and flat.
Mm-hmm.
So this was really nice. A young couple, they purchased this property, 60 acres, or putting 2 ponds in, putting the house between the 2 ponds up on a hill. And so anyway, I have a summer intern, and so I, and that's one of her. I know she was going to be doing tons of models at college, so I figured that would be a good experience for her to do a physical model, and I'll give her our little, because they, in school they just kind of throw you into studio, and you have to learn how to build models, and so kind of giving some practical experience with all the architects here, giving her the shortcuts of things, how to do put this model together.
So tell us how you ended up in Johns Island, and a little bit about your clients and the kind of people you deal with. And you said you do mostly high-end residential work now.
Well, we first came in 1790, and I'm a 6th generation South Carolinian. So.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So supposedly the ancestor left Charleston late 1700s and got a land grant inland. So I grew up about an hour from Charleston. So I studied in Genoa in graduate school, and I said, well, if I can't, work in Europe, I'll work in Charleston. And we just learned today, for the 7th year in a row, we're Travel and Leisure's it's city in the country to come visit. So.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So we got more tourists coming, oh Lord. But anyway, but it's a beautiful place, and I think it's kind of, as I tell people, the thing I enjoy about from being an architect is it's one of the few cities in America where the general population has a pretty good working knowledge of architecture. Like people in Chicago, you're almost kind of forced to discuss architecture to visitors and that sort of thing. Same here too, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so Charleston's a wonderful city. The area that I got to visit, the central kind of old city area, there's a lot of architecture which has been preserved in that location. Am I correct?
Correct. Unfortunate things, because we had the Civil War, which if you look at the photos of the Brady photos after the war, it was pretty decimated. It's pretty amazing. But the Civil War, then we had an earthquake in 1889, and then a hurricane. So basically, what really preserved the city were people, because of the war and the hurricane, they didn't have the money to repair the building. I mean, replace the buildings. So they would kind of patch the buildings together, and so that's why we have that wonderful, lots of, for example, Trad Street in Charleston, I think, has supposedly more pre-revolutionary homes on it than any other street in America.
Wow.
So it's basically kind of from those unfortunate things that happened, and the resiliency of the community, that we have, just kind of repaired things and didn't replace. And so that's why we've got, and then in the 1930s, we had Francis Edmonds, who bought a house. There's a famous place that most people know now called Rainbow Row. It's a series of stucco townhouses. And she started doing a little house history and found out, that this house went back to the early 1700s. So she started the Preservation Society in Charleston to preserve the buildings. And so if you had a historic building that they wanted you to do in-kind replacements and that sort of thing. And so I think that's been one of the other big drivers, because I think it was the first historic area in the country preserved like that.
Wow, that's a lot of really neat history. Now, the clients that come to you, because there's so much traditional architecture around, are they looking for traditional homes as well?
We have. I mean, it's probably the majority of our clients. But the interesting thing about Charleston is they like at least the street facade, especially on a existing home. But again, even we have a Board of Architectural Review here. They've actually opened up a little bit. So like if it's a rear addition, so we've done some really, it looks traditional from the street, but from the rear, you can do really contemporary additions to these historic. And actually the preservation sort of like that, because it clearly demarcates what's old and what's new.
Right.
And but traditionally, in our new ground up homes, the homes tend to be a little more traditional on the exterior, and then we can do some more contemporary on the interior. But occasionally, and actually more recently, it seems that we're having a lot more people asking for contemporary, which is we love, but we just don't get a chance to practice it that often, which is great. So,
what's been interesting about this podcast is talking to architects across the country, and learning about their specific regions. And to me, Charleston would be a big challenge being an architect from Boston. I just think about the climate, whether it's the humidity or the wind or being near the water, and then you have layered onto that the historical significance of that city and its architecture. So I'm interested in, for you, what are the sort of unique challenges of that region? And I think I know the answer, but for an architect that's based there, I mean, there must be something that you learn over the years where you just know this place and you really kind of know what materials, what products, what type of architecture probably is more appropriate. Whereas if Doug and I suddenly dropped into Charleston, tried to do architecture, maybe it would be a steep learning curve. I mean, it would be challenging.
Well, it's yeah, and I've actually repaired buildings by some famous Northeast architects, because this isn't the Hamptons and things don't hold up. So that's one thing I tell the client. I like, this is your home. We'd like you to, put the things in that you want. But the one thing where I'm going to be, draw the line in the sand that won't go over is your exterior envelope, because it's kind of interesting what you said. This has changed completely just because we have learned so much more about, because we have a trifecta here in Charleston. We have flooding, so we have to build above the flood zone. Then we have hurricanes, and we have the same earthquake rating as California.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah, so they were saying that 1889 earthquake was, I think they're saying it was like seven something on the Richter scale, estimated, because of course it didn't exist at that time. But my grandmother, who was alive, she was 3 years old for it. She said uh, that she had heard that it rang bells up in Philadelphia, and I thought, oh, it is a wise tale from my grandmother. But I don't know if you remember that there was that earthquake in Virginia about oh gosh, about 5 years ago, and they felt it all the way down to Atlanta. So the plates on the East Coast are a lot more consolidated than the West Coast. So the energy of an earthquake, but from a structural standpoint, so you got lateral forces. So, but the interesting thing about if you design a home to be resistant to earthquakes, it's also resistant to hurricane. So that's good from the lateral forces. And then like designing in this environment, for example, a lot of our areas have these architectural design review committees. So, they have height limit for the house. And so here, our flood changes, so that the flood zone keeps changing, and then their interpretation of where your finished floor happens within. Because when I started architecture, flood could be at finished floor. Then they changed it so it should be at the lowest part of the lowest horizontal member, which makes sense. So your floor wouldn't be in water. And then the county said, well, let's give a little leeway so that they have a foot of freeboard, which so that gives a little leeway. So for example, when you're doing a house, we get it up, the foundation up. We have to have the foundation shot with a surveyor to certify that is above flood before they allow the walls to be tilted up. So that's which is a smart thing. And it's really kind of interesting to me because my whole 30 plus years of practice here, even in the historic district of Charleston, if you're doing new construction, would allow you to build it up to the new flood, so that again it minimizes the risk if we do have floods and that sort of thing as well. If it's a historic home, you can get special exceptions, because again, you can imagine taking a 200-year-old home and bringing it up. The railings don't meet current codes and that sort of thing. You would probably decimate a historic home trying to bring everything up to code. So there's certain things that they, but now even if you renovate, we go back with treated material below flood, try to mitigate it even in a historic setting. So.
Wow. So, Chris, when I sent you an email a week or two ago, I asked you to give some thought to some things that maybe have been on your mind. I think I said 3 things in regard to architecture, the profession, your clients. Have you had any time to give that some thought?
Good question. Well, mainly kind of what we just kind of touched on, because one of the things, with CRAN, and we have these symposiums in different areas of the country. It really is interesting how, just kind of what we talked about, how we build here in South Carolina. And I've done homes in other places in the country. For example, we did a home up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I was amazed how tiny the foundation was. And we're interviewing, so like we're talking about, with all these storms that we have a lot of horizontal rain just regularly, not necessarily hurricane, but just regular storms. And when you get wind behind water, it can go in amazing places.
Huh.
And so we went up to Charlottesville, got a tour from several of the best builders up there, and I'm like, none of this flashing would work in Charleston, but it was perfectly fine for Virginia. So it's kind of interesting, and that's one thing I think with the Grand Symposiums being built in other all over the country. We have a home tour of all those. For example, we had one years ago up in Seattle, and here it's pretty hot here in Charleston, so our duct work is huge that we have to put into these homes. And Seattle, the reason they can have those beautiful, nice wood ceilings is a lot of places don't even have. They just have radiant floor heating and no air conditioning. So it's you know, we can't live without air conditioning here in the South because it's
Right.
pretty humid. So.
This episode of the Design Your Dream Home podcast is brought to you by CRAN. CRAN is the Custom Residential Architects Network. CRAN is the leading resource and voice for architects who focus on collaborative design with homeowners. CRAN provides support, advocacy, and education for custom residential projects, as well as professional development for its members via forums, symposia, publications, and local activities. To learn more about CRAN, visit www.aia.org/CRAN. This episode of the Design Your Dream Home podcast is brought to you by Porcelanosa. With 30 showrooms in the United States and Canada, Porcelanosa is a luxury lifestyle brand that'll make your next project's dream into a reality. From a wide selection of tiles and mosaics to modern bathroom and kitchen cabinetry designs, Porcelanosa makes it easy to bring modern European design elements into your home. Visit porcelanosa-usa.com to learn more.
You touched on something that our listeners probably don't really understand, and that's flashing. And I don't think we've ever talked about that. Could you explain what flashing is and why you add it to buildings?
Yeah, so basically, we definitely have a kit of parts of putting a building together. And what flashing does, it actually, so you've got, with the heat and cool, different materials expand and contract on different rates and that sort of thing. So the flashing is sort of a metal covering so that it'll protect it from generally moisture. Rain is the main thing to kind of allow for expansion and contraction and not leave a big crack in your home. For example, a friend of mine unfortunately is going through a lawsuit with her roof, and she just gave a deposition last week, and the attorney for the builder goes, and she goes, yeah, there's no flashing from my chimney on the roof. That's why we had this major leak. And this attorney that was interested, well, you don't need flashing. You just need to get up there and maintain with caulk.
Oh my goodness.
And she goes, in our environment, caulk will last about 2 weeks, so it's like I'd have to have someone living up on the roof, So flashing is that kind of backup system that waterproofs your home, basically, and it helps with dissimilar materials and their movement.
And you were talking about earlier having horizontal rain. So the challenge that you've got there in Charleston is you've got these really bad storms. The rain's coming sideways at the house, which means it can penetrate in between where materials come together. And that's typically where we see flashing. So flashing allows that water to, if it does make it through, it then runs down the surface of the flashing and then back out of the building again.
Right. Our theory here is get the water off and away as quickly as possible.
Okay.
And so, like we're talking, all the penetrations, like your windows, doors, have to have. We generally do metal pans, either copper or other types of metal under the doors. We have the flashing around windows and all sort of head flashing so that the water can't come above the window. Because it's interesting, because basically a window failure is if you had like a typical double hung window, water can come through the check rail, the middle rail on a double hung window, come pour down the inside surface of your window.
Yeah.
And when it hits the sill, if it comes into the house, that's a failure. But if it starts pouring out outside, it's not a failure. So I think most people would freak out if water was pouring on the inside of their window. But that's the window manufacturer's definition of window failure.
Interesting.
But
let me ask one question, because this thing about the being sort of a regionalism in design is interesting to me. So let's play a game. So let's say that Chris, one of your clients said, "Hey, I love the architecture that you built for us in South Carolina. We just bought a piece of land in Maine. we want you to build a house for us in Maine. So how would you, as an architect that's so strongly rooted in where you are, um, now being in this very, very different environment, how would you start? How would you, how would you know what to do in that place, in that very different kind of environment?
That you're absolutely right. And first, we do pretty stringent research, and it really helps. And uh, again, Maine, depending on where it is located, but I'm sure they have a similar situation with nor'easters and horizontal rain like we do as well.
Hmm.
The occasion hurricane, but that generally what I do. And I've, over the years, there's some architects that feel like they know everything.
Good.
I'm not one of those people.
Right.
I know we don't know everything. And what I generally find is I find some great craftspeople in the area, and I listen to them and learn what works. And that's the great thing about Charleston is through renovation. So I've renovated buildings that were on the National Register to that you're a couple hundred, or some are almost 300 years old. And it's kind of interesting. You see what materials hold up and that sort of thing. And we do the same sort of thing here. Like I was saying, we've got this salty, hot, humid environment, which is very caustic to materials. The same thing up in Maine. We'd look at the whole exterior envelope, figure out what would be the best surface for them. That again, and this is part of the whole exercise we do with all of our clients, no matter where we're building, is what we have a thing we call life cycle cost. So you'll look at a material and say, hey, this material may cost you 10 or 15% more initially, but you're not going to have to repair it, replace it, or paint it every couple of years. And that's where people, because most of our clients, they're putting a good deal of money into what they build, and we just don't want them to have to come. And that's kind of that mantra is what I use for my affordable housing, and actually gave talks all over the country about affordable housing, which is now becoming a big issue, because even now it's even less affordable than when I started 30 years ago. But the affordable housing needs to be very durable and sustainable. And so that's where we look at these materials. I know one of the first projects I did vinyl windows and was an affordable housing project for downtown Charleston. And it was after Hugo when we had a huge influx of homeless. So we really needed to do more. So we did a 50 unit building in downtown Charleston, and we used the vinyl windows. And actually it's interesting because the vinyl windows at that point in time had some of the best energy ratings, and that project's been there for 25 years and it's still looking great. So you look at things, and instead of putting really cheap product that they're gonna again, from that standpoint, we even looked at doing a lot of vinyl floors, because the homeless or the affordable housing, they usually can't afford a vacuum cleaner, so you got to think about how to clean it. You've got to think out of the box. And then we've also had special clients that have we had one client that was how can I put it nicely, hypersensitive about indoor air quality.
Okay.
And so we had to do a ton of research on that home, because they didn't want anything to off gas. We even looked at they have the low VOC, the volatile organic compounds, in the plywood, and it only had like 1%. So during the whole process of building, that 1% would off gas into the environment before the house gets buttoned up. But they didn't even want that. So we went back to old school, where we did a tongue and groove subfloor instead of plywood.
Wow.
It was a whole nother. The wife, they live at the main home is in Greenwich, and the husband came home with a Geiger counter to her granite countertop, and she goes, "Honey, you're not ripping my granite out. We know there's a little bit of radioactivity in the stone, but it's nothing to hurt us." So it's but it's interesting. You do, and with these clients, you learn these And that's one thing thing I love about our profession is every client is different, every site is different. So, we go through the same process with everybody, but it becomes new each time because every site is different, every client's different, and their criteria. So that's what I think makes it exciting. So I'm not in a candy factory making the same candy over and over again. You're getting to change things. So.
But isn't that interesting? That's the reason why we're not good businessmen, right? Because
Right.
every time we want to reinvent it, and we don't. I mean, it would be better if we would just copy the same details, create the same architecture, and just sort of mass produce it, right? But
Sure.
I find most good architects, they just don't want to do that. It's not in their nature, right?
Right. Right. Well, it's or if I didn't care about the end product, I could make a lot more money. We one of our contractors each year, on a recently completed home, he invites you to a Christmas party, and your entrance to the party is a toy, an unwrapped toy, and it's for this probably 150-year-old orphanage here in Charleston. Receives all the toys. And I was there at one of the parties, and it was a home that I had not designed, another architect had designed. And it was really interesting. This contractor said, "Look at this." I'm like, "What?" He goes, "This architect's just getting a paycheck. There's no passion here. There's no, he said, your homes evoke emotions when people come through. And that's what you want to do. It's like, yeah, that's why you're hiring an architect to, and or people hire us, when these really difficult sites, or we did this one home at Kiowa. There's a 110-inch cluster of live oaks in the middle of the lot, and we were able to, through very sensitive study of the tree, incorporate a home in the lot, and also so it enjoyed the beauty of that tree in their home. So that it's interesting. We like challenges, and I think that's what makes our profession. And we're adaptable, because it's and that's what I was telling our young intern this summer. I said the beauty, when I studied in Italy, architecture is sort of a liberal arts profession in Italy, and here in America, I know friends that are designing tennis shoes and websites. So architecture are problem solvers, which are great, so that we can, you not only are just, and depending on what you design is, there's all sorts of specialties that people can get into just doing churches or one aspect of architecture, it makes it interesting, and you can kind of find where you are. When we were in, one of those 2 a.m. intellectual tech talk where we're all working on a project up at studio in college, we're all talking about it because, we're saying, oh, well, if I have to be a fantastic designer to make a living. And we said, no, I don't think so, because you think about a firm, someone may be a great, personality or people person. So he could be head of marketing for an architectural firm. He doesn't necessarily have to be designing the home, and I worked years ago with one firm where one partner was sort of the design partner, and the other partner was sort of the business person, which I thought was a pretty good combination. Because as you said, a lot of architects, will spend forever working on a project, but hey, to make it profitable, you need a point where you, you stop and move forward, and so it's nice to have kind of checks and balances in that regard.
Chris, do you
And
notice?
also, Doug, you mentioned that so at one point in my career, I did a bunch of restaurants. So that's why I sat for the interior design exam. And so being a registered interior designer, and in that, we kind of talked about that initial conceptual drawings. I actually put furnishings in them, because for most people, they can't perceive space. And so, if they see that bedroom and there's two queen size beds in it, or there's a king size bed, and you can see that there's room for, so I actually put scale furniture in the room so that they can get some sense of how big the room is. So it's hard until you put furniture in it.
I think that's a great point. In fact, I remember going through school. I don't think we ever put furniture in rooms, and then I got out and worked for Job Moore, and after a couple of years, I started noticing, gosh, all of his plans, he shows furniture and everything. And then we'd go to these meetings and clients were like, oh, we could fit the couch there and the bed. I mean, it's absolutely critical to show furniture in your
Right.
buildings.
Well, and you have to, as I always tease people, you have to ask all these very, especially residential architecture, you have to ask a lot of personal questions,
Mm-hmm.
like
Right.
what side of the bed does your husband sleep on? And so if he has to get up in the middle of the night 5 times, and we've done all sorts of things. We've even designed another bedroom on the other side of the master suite. So, if he got back in the bed, he'd wake his wife up. So he'd get up to go to the restroom, and he'd go to the other bedroom to sleep the rest of the night. It's kind of,
I love it.
it's like, hey, whatever, as I tell people with marriage, whatever works for you. It's like we have no judgment here.
I was going to ask, have you noticed that homes are getting smaller? Or we see, that trend, at least in the Northeast. Is that happening in the South?
It is primarily. Yeah, we're seeing a lot more, and that's, I guess, kind of a bad perception for me, because people are kind of know me for my very large homes, but they're a very small percentage. I mean, our kind of bread and butter, it's kind of the 3 to 5,000 square foot. It's kind of our main, and there's certain areas, which is interesting here, where they have maximum square footages, which I think's very smart, because and when they were coming up with some of the criteria, they called me and asked me, what did I think about this? I said, oh, I think that's great. I'd rather have quality rather than quantity,
Yeah.
So.
What a great size for a house. Get a job designing a 3 to 5,000 square foot home. Wow. That's
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
You talked about this interior design certification. I'm interested in that personally. So what did that involve, and why did you feel the need to actually go through that process?
Well, I had actually worked with an architect at one point who was ASID, and I don't know, it just felt like, especially with restaurant design, it's pretty much interior design, because that's the nice thing I liked about doing restaurants. You don't have to worry generally about the building envelope, just so yeah, I did research. I got several books, and actually we started a study group here at Charleston with several interior designers, and sat for the exam. And it's not a cakewalk. I mean, it's a pretty it's interesting now that the design for the registration exam for interior designers has things that we normally don't do, like the durability of how many rubs a particular fabric is, and that sort of thing, or and the fire ratings of different fabrics and foams and all that sort of thing. We have to, which we don't generally do unless you're specifying furniture. And so you have to kind of brush up on all that. But generally, an architectural degree you have to have a professional degree, and whether it's in design. So architecture generally will allow you to be able to take the, after some study, sit and take the course. And I've actually given, and there's codes involved, and now so I've actually given talks to the interior designers about kind of a little code briefing on egress and things that they should be very conscious of when they're taking the exam. When I took the registration exam, shows you how long ago it was. There's a woman, and she was doing her final project. You have to do a design project. She was doing ink on Mylar. I'm like, wow, that woman has some, she's pretty darn confident in what she's doing, because I'm like, I'm doing mine in pencil. I don't trust mine, be able to erase it at last minute.
Yeah.
This when I was doing this TV stuff, this is the kind of thing that kind of became confusing for people, and I can see why, because we're talking about, you're an architect, and now you're saying, well, I had to do this interior design certification, and someone would say, well, what I thought as an architect you can do exterior and interior. What is it that you don't know? And then you have HGTV and all these decorators, and so what is it that interior designers do that they don't do? So it's actually
Right.
gets very fine, and it's very difficult to explain. So if you had to kind of explain, how do you explain, let's say, an interior designer versus an architect?
Well, what I tell our clients is we handle everything. If you flipped your house upside down, we cover everything except what falls out.
I love that.
Okay.
So,
Love it.
but there is a big interface, and generally our main interface, well, like we're talking about furniture placement, electrical, again, doing a lot of restaurants. That's where I really kind of cut my teeth on lighting design,
Hmm.
how lighting can affect a space, and that sort of thing. So that's very key. And window treatments for us, because I hate, we're as architects, we design beautiful window moldings and that sort of thing, and you'll come and there'll be this nasty, clunky plantation shutter box just screwed into your beautiful casing.
Right.
So that's what I tell the interior designers when we're working on projects. Like, let us know what let's talk about window treatments. And because I have it, this is a custom home, and these are areas where you need to show it's a custom home. So we have a detail of how to incorporate that plantation shutter into your existing casing, so it looks like it wasn't an afterthought.
Right.
And also in the electrical, as you know, with the wall acne and that sort of thing, where to place switches, and I've even recessed thermostats into, made little custom recesses, so that, again, because you're going to see the side of it, and you didn't want to walk down the hallway and see this plastic device jutting out in the hallway. So we've done that sort of thing. So, but for the most part, the interior designers are great with color, and a lot of our clients just need that kind of pulling together of the whole, and I think when you have a really good interior designer that gets it, that kind of gets a feel for, that's, early on in the process of our clients, we have what we call a lifestyle interview, where I sit down for half a day with a client. We go more into how they're going to use the home, how they entertain, those sorts of things, so we can kind of not hyper customize a house, but design something that is suited to their needs. And so the interior designers, the good ones in that, I think, kind of see that they get to know the client, know what they want, and there, of course, to talk about getting the rug pulled out from under them with all, here in South Carolina, it's always High Point. Everybody's got a cousin up in High Point or a relative that they want to get a deal on furniture. And now with Wayfair and all these others, and the sad thing is, like, some of it's great, and we've actually used some of that. And like I said, we have clients that want us to do the whole package and do interiors in furnishings as well. We've done that. And that's the main reason I did the ASID, because if I wanted to brief myself to be a more well-rounded residential architect. And I think to do that, you need to, interiors are very, because the moldings and that sort of thing. Because talking to builders, it's interesting, because they were saying, our trim guys love your drawings because you actually show what the moldings, and he said, this other architect says heavy molding. Well, what the heck is
Oh my
heavy
gosh.
molding? How could you price that? It's like, so is it a 1-piece, 3-piece, 12-piece? You need to know that. So so I think all those things come into hand.
Interesting, really interesting.
So, Chris, this has been great. We're coming up on 50 minutes here. I think we're gonna wrap things up. Could you tell our listeners how they can find you, where they can find you and contact you?
Sure. My website is ChristopherRoseArchitects.com, and my local phone number is 843-559-7670, extension 15. I also have a presence on Houzz. Actually, I probably have more presence on Houzz than on my website. So, anyway, they can reach out that way.
Well, Chris, it's been really great to have you today. It's great to see you again, and
Same here.
You gave
Thank
our
you,
listeners
Chris.
a lot to think about. So, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to the Design Your Dream Home podcast with Doug and Steve. If you have any questions or want to give us any feedback on the show, feel free to reach us through our website at thedougandsteveshow.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.